Ma'am, step away from the gate immediately, or we will have you arrested for fraud. The gate agent's voice cut through the busy airport terminal like a knife. Two 17-year-old black twin sisters stood frozen as airport security surrounded them, their boarding passes clutched in trembling hands. "We have legitimate tickets," Haley Thompson said, her voice shaking but determined. "We showed you everything you asked for." "These tickets are fake, and you know it," Supervisor Brian Martinez snapped back. "How did two teenagers like you get last-minute tickets to Los Angeles? Who really paid for these?" The crowd of passengers had stopped what they were doing. Some were recording with their phones, others looked away uncomfortably. Bailey Thompson, Haley's twin sister, felt tears of humiliation burning her eyes as dozens of strangers watched them being treated like criminals. "Please," Bailey whispered, "we just want to get home to our mom. It's her birthday tomorrow." "Save the sob story," Martinez replied coldly. "Security escort these girls from my gate, and someone call the police. We might have a case of credit card fraud here." But when the twin girls called the most powerful airline executive in America to completely shut down the air travel, what happened next defied belief. Within minutes, every single departure board in the entire airport started flashing the same word: delayed. As we start this story, if you believe no child should be discriminated against because of their skin color, click on the subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Haley and Bailey Thompson had woken up that Friday morning at Whitmore Academy, one of Connecticut's most elite boarding schools, buzzing with excitement about their secret mission. These weren't typical 17-year-olds. Haley was already planning her pre-med track with a perfect GPA, while Bailey had just been elected student body treasurer and captained the debate team to state championships. But what made this day special was their plan to surprise their mother for her 50th birthday. Their mom had no idea they were coming home to Los Angeles. She thought her daughters were stuck at school with final exams and wouldn't be able to celebrate with her. The twins had spent months planning this surprise, coordinating with family friends, organizing the perfect party, and most importantly, insisting on handling all the travel arrangements themselves. Their father had always been overprotective, rarely letting them travel without security, private cars, or special arrangements. This trip was their big chance to prove they could navigate the world like normal teenagers. They had deliberately chosen economy tickets instead of first class, dressed in casual clothes instead of designer outfits, and carried regular backpacks instead of expensive luggage. They wanted to blend in completely, to show their father they could handle themselves without any special treatment or recognition. "This is our chance to prove we don't need Dad micromanaging every detail of our lives," Bailey had said as they packed their bags that morning. "Exactly," Haley had agreed. "We handle this trip perfectly, and maybe he'll finally see us as adults instead of little girls who need protecting." They had made a pact. No matter what happened, they would handle it themselves. No calling their father unless it was a true emergency. No using their family name to get special treatment. They were going to succeed or fail on their own merits. What they didn't realize was that their choice to travel under the radar would expose them to discrimination they had never experienced in their sheltered lives. They had no idea that their simple desire to prove their independence would lead to the most humiliating and infuriating experience they had ever faced. The twins had boarded their school shuttle to Hartford Airport that morning, backpacks filled with their mother's favorite Connecticut maple cookies, laughing about how shocked she would be when they walked through the door. They felt so proud of their elaborate planning, so confident in their ability to handle this surprise trip completely independently. As they walked into the departure terminal, Bailey turned to her sister with a huge grin. "See? We totally don't need Dad's security team following us around. We've got this under complete control." Haley had nodded confidently. "Mom is going to be so impressed that we managed this entire surprise without any help. No private jets, no special treatment, just us being normal teenagers." They had no idea that within hours, their definition of normal teenagers was about to be completely shattered. Hartford Airport was buzzing with the typical chaos of a busy Friday afternoon when Haley and Bailey Thompson walked up to Gate B12, their boarding passes clutched in their hands and genuine excitement radiating from their faces. Flight 447 to Los Angeles was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes, and the twins were practically glowing with anticipation about surprising their mother the next day. The gate area was packed with travelers, business people typing frantically on laptops, families juggling crying babies and overstuffed carry-ons, college students sprawled across chairs with their headphones on. It was exactly the kind of normal, chaotic travel scene that made the twins feel proud of their decision to blend in like regular passengers instead of relying on their father's usual private jet arrangements. Behind the gate counter stood Jennifer Walsh, a 43-year-old gate agent who looked like she was having the worst day of her career. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun that had seen better hours. Her airline uniform was wrinkled from a long shift, and she had the kind of stressed expression that comes from dealing with angry passengers all day long. Walsh was juggling what airline workers call a perfect storm situation. The flight was overbooked by 6 passengers, 3 connecting flights had been delayed, and her computer system had been glitching all morning. She had already had to deal with 2 screaming matches over seat assignments, 1 passenger who had somehow lost their ID between security and the gate, and a woman who was threatening to sue the airline because her emotional support peacock wasn't allowed on board. When Haley and Bailey approached her counter with bright smiles and their economy boarding passes, Walsh barely looked up from her computer screen. She was in full multitasking mode, trying to handle passenger check-ins while simultaneously fielding phone calls from her supervisor about the overbooking situation. "Next," Walsh called out in a tired voice, not bothering to make eye contact. Haley, being the more organized twin, stepped forward first and handed over both boarding passes with the kind of polite confidence that comes from good upbringing and expensive education. "Good afternoon, we're checking in for Flight 447 to Los Angeles." That's when something shifted in Walsh's demeanor. Maybe it was the way the twins were dressed, too casual for her assumptions about who flies to Los Angeles on a Friday afternoon. Maybe it was their age. 17-year-olds traveling alone always raised questions. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something unconscious and ugly that she wouldn't have admitted even to herself. Walsh took the boarding passes and stared at them for much longer than necessary. She squinted at the confirmation numbers, held the passes up to the light, and then turned to her computer screen with a frown that seemed disproportionate to whatever problem she thought she had found. "Huh," Walsh muttered, loud enough for the twins to hear. "There seems to be some kind of issue with these tickets." Bailey felt her stomach drop slightly, but she maintained her composure. She had been preparing for minor travel hiccups. That was part of proving their independence. "What kind of issue?" she asked politely. "We printed these from the airline website this morning." Walsh didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept clicking through screens on her computer, making little disapproving noises under her breath. Around them, other passengers were boarding the plane normally. Business travelers, families, even a group of college students who looked exactly like Haley and Bailey. But those passengers weren't getting extra scrutiny. They weren't being questioned about their tickets or made to wait while the gate agent performed some mysterious investigation. Haley noticed this discrepancy immediately. Her analytical mind started cataloging the differences between how they were being treated and how other passengers were being handled. A middle-aged white businessman had just walked up, handed over his boarding pass, and walked onto the plane in less than 30 seconds. A young white couple, probably college age, had done the same thing just moments before. "Is there something specific we can help clarify?" Haley asked, using the diplomatic tone she had learned from years of dealing with demanding teachers and school administrators. She was determined to handle this professionally, the way a mature adult would handle a simple travel problem. Walsh finally looked up from her computer, and her expression had shifted from tired to suspicious. "These tickets show some irregularities in the booking process. How exactly did you purchase these flights?" The question hit both twins like a slap in the face, though they tried not to show it. The implication was clear. Walsh was questioning whether they had legitimately purchased their own tickets. Bailey felt her quick temper starting to flare, but she remembered her promise to herself about staying calm and diplomatic. "We booked them online 3 weeks ago," Bailey said, keeping her voice level. "We can show you the confirmation email, the credit card charge, our student IDs, whatever you need to verify." Haley reached into her backpack and pulled out a folder containing printed copies of every document related to their trip. Confirmation emails, credit card statements, even screenshots of their online check-in process. She had prepared for exactly this kind of situation because she was thorough and responsible, the kind of person who always had backup plans for backup plans. "Here's our confirmation email with the booking reference number," Haley said, maintaining her polite tone. "Here's the credit card statement showing the charge 3 weeks ago, and here are our student IDs showing we're enrolled at Whitmore Academy in Connecticut." Walsh took the documents but barely glanced at them. She was still focused on her computer screen, clicking through what seemed like endless screens of information. "These tickets were purchased with a credit card that doesn't match your names," she said finally. "That's because they were purchased with our father's credit card, with his permission," Bailey explained, feeling her patience starting to wear thin, but still maintaining her diplomatic approach. "We're minors traveling with parental consent. We have a signed letter from our father authorizing this trip." This was true. Richard had signed a travel authorization letter, though he had no idea they were actually planning to use it. The twins had requested it weeks earlier as part of their preparation, telling him they wanted to have it just in case for any future school trips. It was another example of their thorough planning and mature approach to this surprise trip. But Walsh seemed more interested in creating problems than solving them. She had moved from questioning their tickets to questioning their right to travel at all. "Minors traveling alone always require additional verification," she said, though she had just watched several other young passengers board without any extra scrutiny. Around them, the boarding process continued normally for everyone else. Families walked past them onto the plane. Business travelers checked their phones impatiently as they waited in line. College students chatted about weekend plans as they handed over their boarding passes and disappeared down the jet bridge. But Haley and Bailey remained stuck at the counter, subjected to increasingly invasive questions about their travel plans, their family situation, and their right to be at the airport at all. Other passengers were starting to notice the delay, and some were looking over curiously at the two teenagers who seemed to be holding up the boarding process. Haley could feel her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but she refused to let it show. In her mind, she kept repeating the private pact she and Bailey had made: "We handle this ourselves, no matter what." This was their test of independence, and they were going to pass it without running to Daddy for help. Bailey was having similar thoughts, though her natural tendency toward confrontation was making it much harder for her to stay diplomatic. She wanted to point out the obvious discrimination they were experiencing, wanted to demand to speak to a supervisor, wanted to call out the unfairness of their treatment compared to other passengers. But she also kept hearing her father's voice in her head. This was the real world testing their ability to handle challenges independently. If they called him now, if they used his name or influence to solve this problem, they would be proving his point about their need for protection. "We're happy to provide any additional documentation you need," Haley said, pulling out her phone. "We can show you our school enrollment, our emergency contact information, even our flight confirmation numbers from the Airline app." Walsh barely looked at the additional information. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed an extension. "Can you come to gate B12? I have a situation here that needs supervisor approval." The twins exchanged a quick glance. A supervisor meant escalation. It meant more delays, more questions, more public scrutiny, but it also meant they were still handling the situation themselves, still proving their independence and maturity. "We understand you need to follow protocols," Bailey said, using every ounce of her debate team training to keep her voice calm and reasonable. "We're happy to cooperate with whatever verification process you require." But inside, both twins were starting to feel something they had never experienced before. The helpless frustration of being treated unfairly and having no power to stop it. They were used to being respected, listened to, and treated with the dignity that came from their achievements and social status. This arbitrary questioning of their legitimacy was completely foreign to their privileged experiences. Walsh hung up her phone and turned back to them with an expression that had moved from suspicious to openly hostile. "My supervisor will be here in a few minutes to review your documentation. You'll need to step aside so I can continue boarding other passengers." "Step aside to where?" Haley asked, looking around the crowded gate area. "Over there." Walsh pointed to a corner area near the windows, away from the main boarding area. It was the kind of spot where people waited when they were having problems, when they weren't allowed to board with everyone else, when they were being treated as potential troublemakers rather than paying customers. As they gathered their documents and moved to the designated waiting area, both twins felt the weight of other passengers' stares. Some people looked curious, others looked annoyed at the delay, and a few looked sympathetic. But everyone was looking, and everyone was wondering what these two teenagers had done wrong. Bailey whispered to her sister as they sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chairs. "Dad said we could do this trip ourselves. We promised we'd prove we could handle anything." Haley nodded, though she was starting to feel less confident about their ability to resolve this situation quickly. "We're not calling him over something this small," she whispered back. "We can figure this out. We just need to stay calm and professional." But even as she said those words, Haley was beginning to understand what their father had been trying to prepare them for. The real world wasn't always fair. Sometimes people would treat you badly for reasons that had nothing to do with your character, achievements, or worthiness. Sometimes being right wasn't enough to solve a problem. Still, they were determined to handle this challenge on their own. They had worked too hard planning this surprise, had put too much of their pride and independence on the line, to give up now. They would wait for the supervisor, answer whatever questions were asked, and prove that they deserved to be treated with the same respect as any other paying passengers. They had no idea that their situation was about to get much worse, and that their determination to handle everything independently was about to be tested in ways they never could have imagined. Have you ever been discriminated against or treated unfairly or fairly? Share your experience in the comments and hit the subscribe button. When Brian Martinez walked up to gate B12, everything changed for the worse. Martinez was Jennifer Walsh's supervisor, a man in his early 50s who had been working for the airline for over 20 years and had developed what he called a no-nonsense approach to passenger problems. What that really meant was that Martinez had become cynical, suspicious, and way too comfortable making assumptions about people based on their appearance. Martinez was shorter than average, with graying hair and a permanent scowl that made him look like he was perpetually annoyed with the world. He wore his supervisor badge like a badge of authority, and he had a reputation among gate agents for backing up their decisions no matter how questionable they might be. To Martinez, supporting his staff meant never admitting they might be wrong, even when they clearly were. "What's the situation here, Jennifer?" Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he had already made up his mind about what the problem was before hearing any details. Walsh launched into her explanation with the kind of confidence that comes from having your supervisor's automatic support. "These two girls are trying to board with tickets that show multiple red flags. The booking was made with a credit card that doesn't match their names. They're minors traveling without adult supervision, and they can't adequately explain how they obtained these tickets." Every single part of Walsh's summary was either misleading or completely false, but Martinez nodded along like he was hearing about a serious security threat. He turned to look at Haley and Bailey with the kind of suspicious glare usually reserved for people trying to sneak weapons through airport security. "Ladies, I'm going to need to see all of your documentation again," Martinez said, his voice carrying an aggressive edge that Walsh hadn't quite reached. "And this time, I want honest answers about how you really got these tickets." The implication hit both twins like a physical blow. Martinez wasn't just questioning their tickets. He was calling them liars. He was suggesting they had obtained their boarding passes through some kind of fraud or deception. After 17 years of being honor students, model citizens, and respected members of their school community, they were being treated like criminals. Bailey felt her face flush with anger and humiliation, but she forced herself to stay calm. Her debate team training kicked in, and she responded with the kind of measured tone she used when facing hostile judges at competitions. "Sir, we've already provided all of our documentation to Miss Walsh. Our tickets were purchased legally with our father's credit card, with his full knowledge and permission. We have the confirmation emails, credit card statements, and signed parental consent forms." But Martinez wasn't interested in evidence. He had already decided these two teenagers were trying to pull some kind of scam, and he was going to prove it. Parental consent forms can be forged. Credit card statements can be faked. I've seen every trick in the book, and something about your story doesn't add up. Haley felt her analytical mind racing, trying to understand what exactly they were being accused of and how they could prove their innocence. "What specifically doesn't add up, sir?" "We're happy to clarify any questions you have about our travel arrangements." "What doesn't add up," Martinez said, his voice getting louder, "is how two teenagers like you managed to book last-minute tickets to Los Angeles. These flights aren't cheap, and your demographic doesn't typically have access to this kind of travel budget." The racist implication hung in the air like poison. Martinez had just suggested that black teenagers couldn't afford airplane tickets, couldn't have parents with good jobs, couldn't be part of families with enough money for air travel. He had reduced Haley and Bailey's entire identity to a stereotype based on their skin color. Around them, other passengers were starting to notice that something serious was happening. The boarding process had slowed down because Walsh and Martinez were focused on this investigation instead of doing their jobs. People were looking over, some with curiosity, others with growing irritation at the delay. But here's what made the situation even more infuriating. While Haley and Bailey were being subjected to this aggressive interrogation, other passengers continued to board normally. A group of white college students, probably around the same age as the twins, walked up to the gate with boarding passes and were waved through without a single question. A young white couple, clearly traveling together without parental supervision, handed over their tickets and walked onto the plane in less than 30 seconds. The contrast was so obvious, so blatant, that several passengers started pulling out their phones. In 2025, everyone knew that recording injustice was sometimes the only way to make sure it got addressed. A middle-aged black businessman started discreetly filming from his seat near the gate. A young Latina mother traveling with her children positioned herself to capture audio of the conversation. Bailey noticed the phones coming out, and part of her felt relieved that someone was documenting what was happening to them. But another part of her felt mortified that their private humiliation was becoming public entertainment. She had never been the subject of viral videos or social media drama, and the thought of their faces being broadcast across the internet made her feel sick. "We don't need to call anyone," Bailey whispered to her sister, though her voice was shaking slightly. "We can handle this ourselves." But even as she said those words, Bailey was having an internal battle that was tearing her apart. Her phone was in her pocket, and she knew her father's number by heart. One call would end this nightmare immediately. One mention of their last name would probably result in Martinez and Walsh apologizing profusely and upgrading them to first class. But calling her father would also mean admitting defeat. It would mean proving that they really were just spoiled little girls who needed daddy to solve their problems. It would mean giving up on the independence they had worked so hard to achieve and the surprise they had planned so carefully for their mother. Haley was wrestling with similar thoughts, but her analytical mind was also trying to calculate the broader implications of their situation. "If we call him now, he'll never trust us to travel alone again," she whispered to Bailey. "He'll say this proves we're not ready for independence and we'll be back to security details and private jets for everything." This wasn't just about solving their immediate problem. This was about their entire future relationship with their father and their ability to live as autonomous young adults. If they gave up now, Richard Thompson would have proof that the world was too dangerous for his daughters to navigate alone, and they might never get another chance to prove their maturity. Martinez was getting more aggressive, demanding to speak to their parents immediately and threatening to call airport police if they couldn't provide satisfactory verification of their travel arrangements. Other passengers were openly staring now, some looking sympathetic, others looking annoyed at the disruption to their own travel plans. An elderly white woman sitting nearby stood up and walked over to the gate counter. "Excuse me," she said to Martinez, "but I've been watching this entire interaction and these young ladies have been nothing but polite and cooperative. They've shown you multiple forms of identification and documentation. What exactly are you looking for that they haven't already provided?" Martinez turned his aggressive energy toward the woman who had dared to question his authority. "Ma'am, this is airline business and doesn't concern you. Please return to your seat." But the woman didn't back down. "Actually, it does concern me because I'm a paying passenger on this flight and you're delaying our departure to harass two teenagers who clearly have legitimate tickets. This is discrimination, plain and simple." Other passengers started murmuring agreement. A young white man called out, "Yeah, I've been watching too, and this is obviously unfair. Let them board the plane." A black woman traveling with her family stood up and said, "This is exactly the kind of treatment that makes flying miserable for people who look like me and my children." The situation was escalating beyond Martinez's control, and he was starting to realize that his aggressive approach was backfiring. But instead of admitting he might be wrong, he doubled down on his authority. "I need everyone to return to their seats immediately, or I'll have to call security for crowd control." That's when he made the call that would change everything. Martinez picked up the gate phone and dialed airport security. "This is Supervisor Martinez at Gate B12. I need an officer here immediately for a passenger verification issue that's becoming disruptive." Haley and Bailey looked at each other with growing panic. Security meant this was no longer just an airline customer service issue. This was becoming a potential legal situation. They could be detained, questioned by police, possibly even arrested if Martinez convinced security that they were trying to travel with fraudulent documents. Bailey's hand moved toward her phone instinctively. Every fiber of her being was screaming that it was time to call for help. Time to end this nightmare before it got any worse. But Haley caught her wrist and stopped her. "We promised each other we'd prove we could handle anything," Haley whispered urgently. "We said no matter what happened, we wouldn't run to Daddy for help." "But Haley," Bailey whispered back, "they're calling security. This could go on our record. This could affect college applications, scholarships, everything we've worked for. If we call him now, we'll never get another chance to prove our independence," Haley insisted. "He'll use this as proof that we need protection from everything. We'll be right back to being treated like helpless children." The internal struggle was visible on both twins' faces. They were caught between their pride and their practical need for help, between their long-term goals for independence and their immediate need to solve this crisis. Other passengers could see them whispering urgently to each other, could see the phones in their hands, could sense that they were debating whether to make a call that might end their ordeal. If you were with the twins, what would you have advised them to do? Would you support them handling it themselves and risk being arrested, or to accept defeat and give a call to their dad to help them out? Tell us in the comments and share this video to others so they can learn too. When Airport Security Officer David Kim arrived at Gate B12, the situation had already attracted a small crowd of concerned passengers. Kim was a professional who had been trained in de-escalation techniques, and he immediately sensed that whatever was happening here had gotten out of hand. Kim was a Korean-American man in his 30s who took his job seriously, but also understood the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Unlike Martinez, Kim didn't make assumptions about people based on their appearance, and he had seen enough real security threats to know that two polite teenagers with documentation probably weren't dangerous criminals. "What seems to be the problem here?" Kim asked, addressing Martinez but also making eye contact with the twins to signal that he was going to hear all sides of the story. Martinez launched into his explanation, painting Haley and Bailey as suspicious characters who were trying to board with questionable tickets and who had refused to provide adequate verification of their identity. But Kim was listening to more than just Martinez's words. He was watching the twins' body language, observing the other passengers' reactions, and trying to get a complete picture of the situation. The twins looked at each other again, both thinking the same thing. This was their last chance to handle the situation independently. Once they involved their father, once they used their family connections, they would never be able to claim they had proven their ability to navigate the world on their own. Bailey's phone was still in her hand, her finger hovering over their father's contact information. Haley was watching her sister's face, knowing that they were both thinking about the same phone call that could end their humiliation in minutes. But they were also thinking about their mother, waiting at home with no idea that her daughters were planning to surprise her. They were thinking about the months of planning, the excitement of proving their independence, and the promise they had made to handle this trip entirely on their own. "We don't need to call anyone," Bailey said again, but her voice was less certain than before. "We can handle this ourselves. We have all the documentation they need." As Kim began his own review of their tickets and identification, both twins held their breath, hoping that a professional security officer would see what the airline employees had refused to acknowledge, that they were legitimate passengers who deserved to be treated with basic respect and dignity. They had no idea that their situation was about to get much worse, and that their stubborn determination to prove their independence was about to collide with a level of injustice that would test every principle they had ever been taught about fairness, dignity, and the power of doing the right thing. What happened next would haunt Haley and Bailey Thompson for the rest of their lives, not because of what they experienced, but because of how close they came to letting their pride destroy everything they had worked for. After Security Officer David Kim arrived and began his review of their documentation, Jennifer Walsh seemed to realize that her supervisor's aggressive approach might not be enough to make their problem disappear. Instead of backing down or admitting that maybe, just maybe, two honor students with perfect documentation might actually be legitimate passengers, Walsh decided to escalate the situation to a level that would shock everyone watching. "Officer Kim," Walsh said, her voice taking on a tone of fake urgency that made several passengers roll their eyes. "After reviewing these tickets more carefully, I can definitively say that these are fraudulent documents. These girls are attempting to board our aircraft using fake tickets, and I believe this constitutes criminal fraud." The words hit the crowded gate area like a bomb exploding. Fraudulent documents, criminal fraud. These weren't just accusations anymore. These were potential felony charges that could destroy two teenagers' entire futures with a single arrest record. Haley felt the blood drain from her face as the reality of Walsh's accusations sank in. This wasn't just about proving their independence anymore. This wasn't just about missing their mother's surprise party. If Walsh convinced security that they were committing fraud, they could be arrested, charged with crimes, and have criminal records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Martinez nodded along with Walsh's assessment like he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Officer Kim, I've been working for this airline for 20 years, and I can spot ticket fraud from a mile away. These girls have been evasive. Their story keeps changing, and their documentation has more red flags than a communist parade." This was a complete lie. The twins' story hadn't changed at all. They had consistently explained that they were students traveling home to surprise their mother, using tickets purchased with their father's permission. Their documentation was impeccable. But Martinez was doubling down on his initial prejudices, and Walsh was backing him up with increasingly serious accusations. Officer Kim looked uncomfortable with the escalation, but he also had to take fraud accusations seriously. "Ladies, I'm going to need you to come with me for additional questioning while we sort this out. We may need to detain you until we can verify your identities and the legitimacy of your travel arrangements." Detain. The word echoed in both twins' minds like a death sentence. They could be held in airport security, miss their flight, miss their mother's party, and potentially face criminal charges for the crime of trying to fly home while black. Around them, the situation had become a full spectacle. Passengers were openly filming now, and some were providing running commentary for their social media followers. "You guys, I'm watching 2 black teenagers get accused of fraud at the airport right now, and it's obviously discrimination," one young woman was saying into her phone camera. "This is exactly the kind of racist treatment that happens every day." An older black gentleman who had been watching the entire ordeal stood up and approached Officer Kim. "Sir, I've been observing this situation from the beginning, and these young ladies have been nothing but respectful and cooperative. They've provided every document requested, answered every question asked, and maintained their dignity throughout this obvious harassment. As a federal employee myself, I can tell you that what I'm witnessing here looks like textbook discrimination." But his intervention only seemed to make Martinez more defensive. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the complexities of airline security. These girls are trying to board with suspicious tickets, and we have protocols we must follow." "Suspicious how?" The man shot back. "Because they're young? Because they're black? Because they don't fit your assumptions about who can afford airplane tickets?" The accusation of racism hung in the air, and Martinez's face turned red with anger. "I resent that implication. This has nothing to do with race, and everything to do with following proper security procedures." But everyone watching could see exactly what this was about. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While Haley and Bailey faced interrogation and potential arrest, white passengers continued boarding normally. A group of white college students had just walked past the drama, handed over their tickets, and disappeared onto the plane without a single question about fraud or verification. Bailey felt her composure finally cracking under the weight of the injustice and humiliation. Her hands were shaking, her voice was trembling, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely powerless to defend herself through logic and debate. "Haley," she whispered urgently, "we need to call him. This is insane. We need to call Dad right now." But Haley was still wrestling with 17 years of wanting to prove her independence. Even facing potential arrest, even watching their futures potentially destroyed by false accusations, part of her was still thinking about their original goal. "But we wanted to prove we could handle anything," she whispered back, though her voice lacked conviction. "We're about to get arrested," Bailey hissed, trying to keep her voice low enough that the recording phones couldn't pick up their conversation. "Mom's party is tomorrow. If we get detained here, if we get criminal records, everything we've worked for is over. College applications, scholarships, our entire futures, gone because we were too proud to make one phone call." The reality of their situation was finally penetrating Haley's stubborn pride. They weren't just missing a flight anymore. They weren't just failing to prove their independence. They were facing the possibility of criminal charges that could destroy their lives, all because they had been too proud to ask for help when help was desperately needed. Officer Kim was reaching for his radio, preparing to call for backup and begin the process of formally detaining them for questioning. Walsh was standing behind the counter with a satisfied expression, like she had finally proven whatever point she had been trying to make. Martinez was nodding approvingly, convinced that his 20 years of experience had correctly identified 2 teenage criminals. "Our independence isn't worth missing Mom's birthday," Haley finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "And it's definitely not worth getting arrested for crimes we didn't commit." Bailey felt a wave of relief wash over her as her sister finally acknowledged what they both knew had to happen. "We can't handle this alone," Haley continued, her analytical mind finally accepting the reality that some problems were bigger than teenage pride and stubborn determination. "Thank God," Bailey whispered back. "I was about to call him anyway, even if you tried to stop me. This has gone way too far." Both twins looked down at Haley's phone, at the contact labeled, "Dad, emergency only, Richard Thompson." For months, they had looked at that contact as a symbol of their father's overprotectiveness, a reminder of the independence they were fighting to achieve. Now, it represented their only hope of escaping a nightmare that threatened to destroy everything they had worked for. "He's going to be so disappointed that we couldn't handle it," Haley said, her voice filled with shame and defeat. "Better disappointed than us in jail," Bailey replied, though she was also dreading the conversation they were about to have. Their father had challenged them to handle the real world independently, and they were about to prove his point about needing protection. With shaking hands, Haley dialed the number while Bailey moved closer so they could both hear the conversation. Around them, the gate area had become a circus of recording phones, arguing passengers, and airline employees who had lost complete control of the situation. The phone rang once, twice. Then their father's familiar voice answered with immediate concern. "Haley? What's wrong?" The sound of their father's voice, calm and protective and instantly focused on their well-being, broke through the last of their stubborn pride. "Dad," Haley said, her voice shaking with emotion and relief. "We tried to handle it ourselves. We really tried. We're at Hartford Airport, Flight 447 to Los Angeles, and they think our tickets are fake. They're saying we committed fraud. They're talking about calling the police and having us arrested." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and both twins could practically hear their father's mind processing the information and formulating a response. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone they had never heard before. Protective fury mixed with absolute authority. "You did nothing wrong," Richard Thompson said, his voice cutting through their shame and fear like a lifeline. "You should never have had to handle this kind of treatment. You are legitimate passengers with legitimate tickets that I personally purchased and authorized. Stay calm, stay together, and don't let them separate you. This ends right now." The relief that washed over both twins was overwhelming. They weren't in trouble with their father for failing to handle the situation independently. They weren't disappointing him by asking for help. He was proud of how they had conducted themselves, and he was going to fix everything. "Put me on speaker," Richard continued, "and hand the phone to whoever is in charge of this harassment." But before the twins could comply with their father's request, something extraordinary began happening around them. Officer Kim's radio crackled to life with an urgent message that made his face go pale. Martinez's phone started ringing with what was clearly an emergency call from his superiors. And Jennifer Walsh suddenly looked like she had seen a ghost as her own phone began buzzing with incoming messages. Within exactly 2 minutes of Haley ending her call with their father, Walsh received a phone call that would change everything. Her confident, aggressive demeanor crumbled as she answered a call from what was clearly corporate headquarters, and everyone in the gate area could hear her side of the conversation. "Yes, sir," Walsh said, her voice suddenly small and terrified. "Yes, I understand the situation. No, sir, I had no idea. Yes, sir. Immediately, sir. I will handle this personally. Yes, sir, right away, sir." As Walsh hung up her phone, her hands were visibly shaking. The woman who had been so confident about accusing 2 teenagers of fraud just minutes earlier now looked like she was about to lose her job, and everyone watching could see the complete transformation in her demeanor. But that was just the beginning. Over the airport's PA system, an announcement began that would affect thousands of travelers and cost the airline industry millions of dollars. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing system-wide operational holds affecting all departures. We apologize for any inconvenience and will provide updates as they become available." Haley and Bailey looked at each other with a mixture of relief, confusion, and growing awareness that their father's response to their situation was far more dramatic than they had expected. Around them, passengers were pulling out phones to check flight statuses, and departure boards throughout the airport were beginning to flash the same message: Delayed. Operational hold. They had asked their father for help with their specific problem, but somehow their phone call had triggered something much bigger. Something that was affecting not just their flight, but every flight in the airport. Something that was costing the airline enormous amounts of money and inconveniencing thousands of travelers. As they watched Walsh frantically making phone calls and Martinez receiving what appeared to be very serious instructions from his superiors, both twins began to realize that their father's influence might be far greater than they had ever understood, and that their simple request for help had just set in motion events that would change everything. The twins had spent hours trying to prove they could handle the world independently, but in less than 5 minutes, their father was about to show them exactly how much power he had to change that world when his daughters were threatened. What happened next was like something out of a movie, except it was completely real and happening in front of dozens of passengers who were recording every single moment. Within 20 minutes of that phone call, a convoy of 3 black SUVs pulled up to the terminal entrance with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't their first emergency response. Airport security immediately began redirecting traffic, and within minutes it became clear that whoever was arriving had the kind of power that made entire airports change their operations. Richard Thompson stepped out of the lead vehicle, and everyone who saw him immediately understood that this was a man who commanded respect wherever he went. He was tall, distinguished, wearing an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and he moved with the kind of confident authority that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of people. But what struck everyone most was the controlled fury in his eyes. This wasn't just a wealthy businessman dealing with an inconvenience. This was a father whose daughters had been threatened, and he was visibly struggling to contain his rage long enough to handle the situation professionally. Airport executives were literally running through the terminal to meet him, and their panicked expressions made it clear that whoever Richard Thompson was, he had the power to end careers with a single phone call. The same administrators who had been nowhere to be found when 2 teenagers were being accused of fraud were suddenly very interested in customer service and proper procedures. Haley and Bailey watched their father's approach with a mixture of emotions that was almost overwhelming. Relief that their nightmare was finally ending. Embarrassment that their independence experiment had failed so spectacularly. Love for the man who had dropped everything to rescue them. And just a tiny bit of shame that they had needed rescuing at all. Richard walked straight to his daughters, ignoring every airport official and airline employee who was trying to get his attention. "Are you hurt?" he asked immediately, his hands gently checking their faces and arms like he was looking for physical injuries. "Did anyone touch you? Did anyone threaten you physically?" "We're okay, Dad," Haley said, though her voice was still shaky from the stress of the past few hours. "They didn't hurt us, but they were going to have us arrested." That's when Richard Thompson turned to face Jennifer Walsh, Brian Martinez, and Officer Kim with an expression that made several nearby passengers take a step back. The controlled fury in his voice was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. "I am Richard Thompson, CEO of Aeroglobal Industries," he said, and the impact of those words was immediate and devastating. Aeroglobal Industries was the parent company that owned not just this airline, but a dozen other major carriers, several airport management companies, and a significant portion of the aviation industry's infrastructure. Jennifer Walsh had just spent hours accusing the CEO's daughters of fraud. Brian Martinez had just threatened to have the boss's children arrested. They had both just committed career suicide in the most public way possible. Walsh's face went completely white as the reality of the situation hit her. Martinez looked like he was about to faint. Even Officer Kim, who had been trying to handle the situation professionally, realized that he had been caught in the middle of a discrimination incident involving one of the most powerful executives in the aviation industry. "You nearly had my daughters arrested," Richard continued, his voice getting quieter and more dangerous, "for flying on tickets that I personally purchased, authorized, and approved. You accused 2 honor students of fraud because you couldn't believe that black teenagers might have parents successful enough to afford airplane tickets. The racist assumption was now out in the open, stated clearly by someone with the authority and power to do something about it. There was no hiding behind airline policies or security procedures anymore. Everyone present could see exactly what had happened and why it had happened. Richard turned back to his daughters, and his expression softened completely. You tried to handle this yourselves, and you should never have had to endure this kind of treatment. You conducted yourselves with dignity and grace in the face of obvious discrimination, and I am proud of how you represented our family and your own character. Those words hit both twins harder than anything else that had happened that day. Their father wasn't disappointed that they had failed to prove their independence. He wasn't angry that they had needed his help. He was proud of them for maintaining their dignity under pressure, for treating their accusers with more respect than they had shown in return. But Richard wasn't finished. He turned back to the airline staff with the kind of cold fury that corporate executives use when they're about to destroy someone's entire career. My daughters showed you more grace and patience than you deserved, he said. They provided every document you requested, answered every question you asked, and maintained their composure while you subjected them to racist harassment in front of dozens of witnesses. Then Richard made a decision that would affect thousands of travelers and cost the aviation industry millions of dollars, but which he considered completely justified given what his daughters had experienced. Every flight operated by Aeroglobal Industries and its subsidiaries is grounded immediately, he announced, pulling out his phone to make the call that would shut down air travel across multiple states. No aircraft moves until every employee has completed mandatory discrimination training and until we have implemented new policies to ensure this never happens to anyone's children again. Airport executives were frantically trying to calculate the cost of what Richard was proposing. Thousands of flights, millions of passengers, billions of dollars in lost revenue and disrupted travel plans. But Richard Thompson had the authority to make that decision, and he was willing to accept the financial consequences if it meant protecting other families from what his daughters had experienced. Your independence matters, he said to Haley and Bailey, but your safety and dignity matter more. You should never have to choose between proving your maturity and protecting yourselves from discrimination. Within minutes, the consequences began rolling out with corporate efficiency. Jennifer Walsh was terminated immediately, her badge confiscated, and security escort arranged before she could even clean out her locker. Brian Martinez was demoted to baggage handler with mandatory retraining and probationary status. The entire incident was being reviewed by corporate legal teams who were already calculating potential lawsuit settlements and planning company-wide policy overhauls. Officer Kim, who had tried to handle the situation professionally despite the airline employee's prejudices, was commended for his restraint and offered a position with Aeroglobal's corporate security division with a significant salary increase. But the most important conversation happened privately, away from the cameras and recording phones, when Richard sat down with his daughters to explain something that would change their relationship forever. Calling for help when you need it is taking care of yourselves, he told them. True independence isn't about handling every situation alone. It's about knowing when you can solve problems yourself and when you need support from people who love you. Haley looked at her father with new understanding. We wanted to prove we didn't need you, she admitted. We wanted to show that we could handle anything independently. You proved something much more important, Richard replied. You proved that even when facing injustice, you could maintain your dignity, treat others with respect, and make good decisions under pressure. Those are the qualities that matter most in the real world. Bailey felt tears in her eyes as she realized what her father was saying. So you're not disappointed that we had to call you? I'm disappointed that I live in a world where my daughters have to face discrimination, Richard said. But I'm proud that when you did face it, you handled it with more maturity and grace than adults twice your age. That's the kind of independence that really matters. The story went viral within hours, with passenger recordings showing the entire incident from multiple angles. The hashtag airport discrimination began trending, and other families started sharing their own experiences with similar treatment while traveling. The incident sparked congressional hearings on discrimination in the aviation industry and led to policy changes that affected every major airline in the country. But for Haley and Bailey Thompson, the most important outcome was much more personal. They finally made it to Los Angeles, not on their original economy flight, but on their father's private jet, arriving just in time for their mother's surprise party. Sarah Thompson's joy at seeing her daughters was only enhanced when she learned about their ordeal and how they had handled it. "I raised brave, dignified young women," she said, hugging them both tightly. "And I married a man who will move heaven and earth to protect his family." The surprise party became a celebration not just of Sarah's 50th birthday, but of a family that had learned important lessons about the balance between independence and support, that between self-reliance and knowing when to ask for help. 6 months later, Haley and Bailey graduated from Whitmore Academy with full college scholarships and a deeper understanding of both injustice and their own strength. They had learned that true independence doesn't mean facing every challenge alone. It means having the wisdom to know when you can handle something yourself and when you need backup from people who love you. Their father's response to their ordeal had cost the aviation industry hundreds of millions of dollars and changed policies that affected millions of travelers. But Richard Thompson considered it the best money he had ever spent because it had protected his daughters and potentially prevented other families from experiencing the same discrimination. The Thompson family learned that independence and family support aren't opposites. They're complementary forces that make each other stronger. Sometimes the most independent thing you can do is admit when you need help, and sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let their children try to handle challenges on their own, while being ready to step in when those challenges become unfair or dangerous. And most importantly, they learned that dignity under pressure, treating others with respect, even when they don't deserve it, and standing up against injustice are the qualities that really define character and independence. Those lessons would serve Haley and Bailey well as they continued growing into the remarkable young women their parents had raised them to be. If you enjoyed this story, click on the subscribe button and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.